course, I think what you're asking is the parties that are engaged in the open political system, the democratic system, parliament, and so on and so forth. Of course, Balochistan has gone through, over the years, quite a transmogrification as far as the political forces are concerned, these open mainstream political forces are concerned. Today, if we cast a glance at, for instance, the Balochistan Assembly, what do we see? We see the successor party of Ghaus Bakhsh Bizenjo, who once the 70s insurgency ended and they all came back out of prison, Hyderabad, he formed the National Party, NP for short. Today the coalition, the ruling coalition in Balochistan is headed by the National Party, despite the fact that it is not the major party in the coalition. Its chief minister is Dr. Abdul Malik Baloch, who is a person of middle class background, doctor by profession, and I think the reason why that party was given the chief ministership, despite the fact that Nawaz Sharif's PMLN has the larger number of MPAs, is because Nawaz decided in his wisdom that this party enjoys amongst the moderate nationalists perhaps the most credibility, and giving it the reins of government would help the coalition run smoother. This has produced angst amongst his own members of the Provincial Assembly, and they have been protesting to the Prime Minister about being shortchanged. That, although they have acquiesced in Nawaz Sharif's decision to give Malik Baloch the chief ministership, they are still agitating this issue. And if recent reports and rumors are anything to go by, there's every possibility that there will be a coup within the coalition soon, and Dr. Abdul Malik Baloch may be removed in favor of a PMLN chief minister. Apart from these two parties, of course there is the People's Party, which had its government in the province in the last term between 2008 and 2013 as a result of the 2008 elections. But People's Party in Balochistan, like elsewhere in Pakistan with the exception of Sindh, has suffered reverses. So it is not a strong party at the moment. And apart from these, there is of course the Balochistan National Party Mengal, headed by Akhtar Jan Mengal, the son of Sardar Atullah Mengal, who was the chief minister in 71 as a result of the 1970 elections, and whose government was dismissed by Mr. Bhutto, and which led to the insurgency. He was serving as the chief minister under Nawaz Sharif's government, his second government, when he came to power in 97. And he was dismissed, and his government was dismissed by Nawaz Sharif because he objected, protested, resisted the nuclear explosions in Chaghi in 1998. So he was dismissed. Nawaz Sharif has had occasion since to regret that decision, because if you are talking about mainstream nationalist parties, then the BNP Mengal enjoyed even more credibility, perhaps, than the National Party does today. And I think that dismissal set back the PMLN considerably in Balochistan. They've recovered it now in the 2013 elections. But I think in the years in between, that decision or that action did produce a lot of bitterness. Apart from these, there are the Pashtun parties. There's the JUI, which has had a traditional base of support amongst the Pashtuns. Balochistan is almost neatly divided between the northern parts, which are Pashtun, and the rest of Balochistan, which is Baloch. And Quetta is the meeting ground of both, but Pashtun presence and representation in Quetta is considerable. Apart from the JUI, there is the Pakhtunkhwa Milli Awami Party, which is again a Pashtun party, set up by Mahmud Achakzai's father, Abdul Samad Achakzai, who was, if you like, the equivalent of Bacha Khan in Balochistan. He was known as the Baloch Gandhi, Balochistan Gandhi, as opposed to Bacha Khan, who was known as the Frontier Gandhi. Same philosophy, Gandhian, non-violent, etc., etc. Abdul Samad Achakzai was assassinated during the 1970s, and then his son took over, who is still the leader of the party. That party has gained considerable space and leverage in the present setup. They have one minister in the cabinet, who happens to be Mahmud Khan Achakzai's brother. Another brother is the governor. Mahmud Khan himself is a member of the National Assembly. So he is not in this setup, but his two brothers are. And therefore PKMAP, as it's called, has quite a toehold in this coalition government. That's the broad outline. There are some independents also. But this is a very different scenario from what emerged in the 1970 elections, when the alliance of NAP and JUI under Maulana Fazlur Rahman's father, Mufti Mahmud, won the elections in Balochistan and in what was then NWFP, and through negotiations formed their governments there. But once Ataullah Mengel's ministry was dismissed in 1973, the Mufti Mahmud ministry in NWFP resigned in protest. So you had the insurgency following in Balochistan, and you had troubles following in NWFP. It is interesting to note that when the 70s insurgency ended in 1977, since it did not achieve its goals, which at that point the articulated goals were autonomy, not independence, and the grievances about deprivation, whether it was natural resources or other rights that Balochistan felt it had been deprived of. Now, of course, between 1977 and particularly once the leadership was released from Hyderabad jail, January 1st, 1978, if memory serves, the armed struggle or armed resistance option had suffered a reverse. And people like Ghaus Bakhsh Bizenjo, whose son Senator Hasil Bizenjo is the head now of the NP, argued that armed struggle and armed resistance was not the way for the Baloch to wrest their rights. They must engage in the system. They must take part in elections. They must take the parliamentary road, in other words. And they did that. And many nationalists followed that between 1977 and 2002. That's a considerable period of 25 years. And in between, I mentioned the episode of Akhtar Jan Mengel, whose ministry was dismissed in 98. 25 years of engaging with the mainstream political system, working through the electoral process, through the assembly, parliament, etc., etc. It's the frustration of not being able to achieve what they set out to achieve under Bizenjo's guidance path, whatever, that persuaded some in the younger generation to adopt once again the path of armed struggle. And it was an embryonic beginning in 2002 and largely confined at that point to the Murri tribe, which has always been the leading tribe in any rebellion in Balochistan history. By 2006, when Nawab Akbar Khan Bugti was killed by the Musharraf regime, and the Bugti tribe, or at least a considerable section of it, revolted for the first time in Balochistan's history. They had always been negotiators before that. And of course, new groups emerged, like Dr. Allah Nazar, who was a middle-class doctor, has been in prison, has been tortured, and then eventually came to the conclusion that there was not much to be gained except through armed struggle. So took to the mountains. So 25 years of parliamentary struggle, frustration, unable to achieve any of their, the redressal of any of their grievances or wrest any of their rights, as Bizenjo thought could be done through the parliamentary road, and then eventually, once again, armed resistance. That is the insurgency which still continues to this day. But of course, between 2002 and 2006, it was still small, incipient, confined. By now, most parts of Balochistan have seen some form of armed resistance or the other. Some areas more, some areas less, but it's there.
How and why is the middle class getting involved?
Why is it getting involved? First of all, as I mentioned earlier, there's been a considerable growth in the middle class, largely because of education. I mean, even in the 70s, there was a small middle class, but by now, that is a considerable number, and that middle class, its spread is extensive. It's throughout Balochistan. It's not just Quetta or not just the big cities, you know. Students who didn't have higher education institutions in their own areas flocked to Quetta or flocked to Karachi or went elsewhere for higher education. It's perhaps not an accident then that from their ranks have arisen. There were always middle class components in the older parties also, the cadre, the workers, you know, second rank leadership and so on. But now, and a very active student movement, the Baloch Students Organization, for example, which later split into two groups. But anyway, so that tradition of student and youth activism and middle class activism is still around and perhaps even wider spread, and part of it has, for the same reasons that I've stated earlier, frustrated with their inability to make any impact through the parliamentary road, have taken to the mountains to wage armed struggle. So it's a linkage that you can see, the evolution of Baloch society, the growth of a middle class, and then of course its representation in the various strands of politics that define Balochistan today. First, I mean, you've asked a whole series of questions, but first and foremost, I think it is not inevitable that settlers and non-Baloch should be targeted. It didn't happen in the past, up to and including the 70s insurgency. It happened for a while in this insurgency, but I think it has petered out, and just as well, because I think the wisdom dawned finally that this was not a good tactic. It was, if anything, alienating sympathy, support for the movement, and so I think that is more or less finished now. But yes, it did exist for a while, but at least 2 years, I think. So it's not inevitable, number one. Number two, yes, the Baloch diaspora outside Balochistan, whether inside Pakistan, other provinces, or abroad, there are a lot of them working in the Gulf, for example, and elsewhere. This is part economic necessity, part troubled conditions in the home province, in their particular area. And so I think these two things come together and do persuade a lot of people to seek greener pastures elsewhere, because Balochistan is troubled, there is a law and order problem, there's an insurgency problem. There are the activities of the Frontier Corps, which is leading the counterinsurgency effort, and some of their actions are indiscriminate and produce a lot of collateral civilian damage. People being picked up, people being killed, villages being attacked, etc., etc. So, I mean, obviously, in a situation of what is virtually a civil war going on, you're going to have these movements, these demographic movements, people going out of the province or going out of their area, trying to find something better elsewhere. So that's not surprising for me. Now, Gwadar, you mentioned, is a pretty typical example of what has been going on in Balochistan over the last 67 years since Pakistan came into being. Gwadar, I think I mentioned earlier, was an enclave owned by Oman until 1958, when it was bought back by the Ayyub regime. It is a natural harbor. And the potential for it becoming a port was always recognized on paper or in theory, but not much was done about it over the years. It seemed an unlikely prospect to many, remote, out on the Makran coast, with nothing there. It was a little fishing village to begin with. So building a port there, I think, required a leap of imagination, which did arrive with time, finally. Because one of the reasons for that was that Karachi, the only port that Pakistan has, is so overcrowded now. It's impossible to get an efficient turnaround of ships and cargo and so on and so forth. It's a real bottleneck. So an alternative port made sense, and Gwadar was the obvious choice. There is also a naval base not far from Gwadar, or Mada it's called, but that's a small military facility. It's not a developmental project. Now what happened in Gwadar was, once the announcement of the port was made, you got a lot of carpetbaggers, investors and speculators buying land in Gwadar in anticipation of its development, because there was a fortune to be made. And this land was bought from local people at dirt cheap prices. And obviously, as soon as the gold rush in land, if you like, started, prices went through the ceiling. So clearly there was much money to be made. Although the simple local folk sold their land for dirt cheap prices, but the issue became a canker again, because the feeling was that local people in their ignorance have been exploited by sharks and speculators from outside. And the danger that, because Balochistan already has a small population, it's only about 5 to 7% of Pakistan's population, and it is nomadic, tribal, scattered, etc., apart from one or two cities. The danger was that if the Gwadar port and the city that would grow around it were to continue unimpeded, this speculative land rush was indicating what would happen. There would be a great influx of people from outside the province. It would change the demography of Balochistan and make it impossible for the Baloch to assert their rights as the original inhabitants of the province. This became a canker, it became an issue, and Sardar Ataullah Mingle at one stage put forward the demand that people who come to work in Gwadar should not be given local voting rights. They should be given a special dispensation, so they come only to work but don't vote. There are examples of this elsewhere. For example, that we have a considerable labor force in the Gulf. But although they are, of course, foreign countries, but no one is allowed to vote there. They don't have those rights there. Given the history of deprivation in Balochistan and the apprehension that this demographic shift would damage or inflict damage on the rights of the Baloch, the local inhabitants, therefore this proposal was put forward. But Gwadar port and the city and its development in any case has been subject to so much delay over the years and so much stalling that the issue is out there somewhere, but it's not a hot issue at the moment. Clearly, the grievance is rooted in what has gone on in the past. Sui gas used all over Pakistan, not available in Balochistan. The Sandak project, gold and copper, started and then mothballed for 15 years before the Chinese were invited back in to run it. Rekodik, even larger gold and copper project, which is still the subject of an international arbitration case between the foreign company that was doing the exploration and prospecting and preparation, and now the Balochistan government, which thinks that it should be able to run the project itself. Whether it can, whether it has the expertise, this is also a matter of contention. But I think this present government of Dr. Abdul Malik Baloch has put forward the proposal that that contract should be cancelled and that Balochistan should run this project itself. Again, stemming from this old sense of deprivation, grievance, and locals not being accommodated. Just to give you an example, originally when the Sandak project was developed, the terms of the contract indicated that the Chinese company that developed it would provide training, skill enhancement, etc., to local people, to provide employment and to provide some sense of ownership of the project. But it never happened. The project was mothballed for 15 years, and by the time it was revived with another Chinese company, all those terms were washed away. So today you have a project which is being run by the Chinese with their engineers and workers coming from China and no local representation or employment. So you can see how these layers and layers of deprivation and a sense of injustice have accumulated over the years and produce time and again on every issue, whether it's Gwadar or these gold copper projects or anything else, produces this reaction that we have been hard done by in the past, and we are likely to be hard done by again, and therefore there's resistance to these things. Now, to your last question, how many people in Balochistan, amongst the Baloch, want an independent Balochistan? Very difficult to give you a quantified answer. This is not a situation where you can go out and take a census or an opinion poll, to even say in Balochistan that you support an independent Balochistan can bring down the wrath of the authorities on you. So you're not going to get answers to this. So it's hidden, it's underground, we don't know. But judging from what I know about Balochistan and about their sentiments, it is certainly a growing sentiment. Separatism is a growing sentiment because, again, of the oppressive policies that have been followed, the disappearances, the frontier corps operations, and the outsourcing of operations to mercenary death squads, which also are responsible and now increasingly mainly responsible for disappearing people. So clearly there is a growing sentiment. There's no figure I can put on it, but my apprehension has been for many years, if the federal government continues on its present path, then the likelihood of that sentiment growing and becoming perhaps at some stage unstoppable if it gets support from some big power in the region or beyond, then I think Pakistan will be in a lot of trouble. I think the narrative has remained reasonably consistent from the federal authorities and their local Balochistan-based partners. And that has been that Balochistan is backward and poor, has resources, but they need development, and so Balochistan needs development. And development includes education, health services, all the rest of it. And added to that narrative is the fact that the insurgents, who they classify as Sardari elements that are resisting modernization, resisting development, they stand in the way by their sabotage activities. The fact of the matter is that in the last government, the People's Party government in Quetta, President Zardari announced a package for Balochistan. It was called Aghaaz-e-Haquq-e Balochistan, the beginning of giving Balochistan its rights. Not much of a beginning was made. And all the tall claims about providing employment, providing education, providing youth with a constructive path rather than, and weaning them away from insurgency and armed struggle, they remained claims on paper. And I do not think that they made a significant impact on the situation. The military too lent its weight to that paradigm in their military institutions and outside new institutions that they've created. They've set up colleges, they've set up schools, they've set up cadet training kind of institutions. The impact is there but very small. And can it substitute for what I believe is the solution, and that is a politically negotiated coming together with the nationalist insurgents, providing thereby a political settlement, peace, then development will make sense because it will have ownership of the local people, impose development from on top as an adjunct to counterinsurgency and oppression, is going to meet resistance. And so no matter how many miles of rail and road and pipelines you put in, and electricity networks and whatnot, you always run the risk of this being seen as an imposed development and no ownership and, if anything, resistance to it. So I think the government's narrative is clear. It's posing development, modernization versus a traditional Sardari-dominated society which resists this because it's a vested interest. Facts are otherwise. Most of the Sardars are with the federal government and with the provincial government. There are very few in resistance today. That too has changed, So not considerably, because even in the 70s insurgency that was the case. But I think the difference is that whereas there were out of 104 Sardars in Balochistan, in today's insurgency there are very few prominent Sardars that you can name. There are sons of Sardars leading the struggle, but I suppose that too is a function of time passing. Now, insurgency, armed struggle, resistance is clearly a young man's job. So it is inevitable that the older generation, part of which is gone and part of which is old, is no longer leading it. People who are leading it are new generation, younger people, perhaps with more zeal than always wisdom. But that too is a function of the way things have gone in Balochistan. Long-standing resentment, anger, and sense of grievance and deprivation. So when you see the separatist sentiment growing, it's a function of oppression on the one hand and historical grievance on the other. There is a platform or organization in Balochistan called Voice of Missing Persons. It's led by a gentleman called Mama Kadir, who's been agitating this issue for a long time. His own family has lost people, and those who have flocked to his banner have lost people. They have a very large number of what they say are missing persons, something like 18,000. Not all those cases are documented, and therefore the authorities have the luxury of rejecting this figure and saying it's far lower. But they too don't have all the facts and all the cases. And also, although the missing persons case has found resonance in not only the Balochistan and Peshawar High Courts, by the way, because Khyber Pakhtunkhwa also has missing persons, but even up to and including the Supreme Court, which took a very great interest in the case during the previous Chief Justice's tenure, Iftikhar Mohammad Chaudhry, but nothing came of it. The intelligence agencies, despite being collared and summoned to court, were able to still wrap themselves in this cloak of impunity under which they operate, historically have always operated, and to muddy the water so much that no conclusive, outcome of the case was possible. It's still in the courts. Still nothing's happened. The other day I read a report that I think 900 and some, almost 1,000 cases have been settled, i.e. how they've been settled is not clear. Settled meaning the file is closed. Either the people have been found, or they've been found to be dead, or no longer here, whatever the case. But there are still thousands of families in Balochistan waiting for their loved ones to return with no news, no closure, in total agony. These are people suspected of being involved with the insurgency or supporting the insurgency, and they need not even be actively supporting the insurgency. Some of them are picked up because of their voiced dissent to what is going on in Balochistan, i.e. they may be nationalist, but they may not be insurgents. Very difficult to get hold of the insurgents. So what the authorities tend to do is concentrate their efforts on people they perceive to be supporters of the insurgents because of a nationalist position. And they are picked up and disappeared and never heard from again. And I think this is a humanitarian disaster. And I am sorry to say that there has not been sufficient agitation or voice given to this issue inside Pakistan or even outside Pakistan. if this had been happening anywhere else. I give you an example. In Nigeria, Boko Haram kidnapped something like 200 girls, and we're still agitating about it the world over. But what about here? It's been going on for years, and there isn't the same kind of resonance or the same kind of voice. Balochistan seems to most people to be remote, distant, and not so important, sadly. I think it should have. Whether it has is doubtful, because I find that they are unable to see beyond their nose in many respects, and in some respects the propaganda from the establishment is misleading. For example, there's a new narrative emanating from the security establishment which says that India is behind the insurgency in Balochistan, and that has now been extended to India being behind also the TTP, the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan. So everything that's happening in Pakistan, this is seen through this India-obsessed prism. Number one, they provide no evidence for this. Number two, even if we take it on faith, the argument for a political settlement internally with the Baloch, mainstreaming them, bringing them into the system, and giving them a redressal of their rights makes even more eminent sense. Because if you have troubled waters, the temptation for others to fish is greater. If you can calm your own waters, then the opportunity and the temptation both will disappear. So even if that a claim of Indian support and Indian backing is taken at face value, it still does not negate the argument for an internal negotiated political settlement of a long-standing problem in Balochistan. The government, I do not think, is sufficiently aware of the seriousness of the problem, despite the loss of East Pakistan. The reason we've learnt little, if anything, from the East Pakistan debacle is because we swept it under the carpet. We didn't even allow the publication of the Hamoudur Rahman Commission report, which is all about the whole Bangladesh episode. Nothing came forward. It was suppressed. So people who sweep things under the carpet learn nothing from their mistakes, and therefore are condemned by history to repeat those mistakes. And we are repeating those mistakes, and we are not understanding that we talk from morning to night of the need for democracy in Pakistan, where taking steps or making efforts to consolidate it. How can a democracy function that is not inclusive? One part of the country, a very large part of the country, admittedly with a small population, but a very large territory, is not included. If anything, it is suppressed and oppressed. Now that doesn't sound to me like a feasible future. The government should be worried. Right now, the Baloch have little, if any, support in the international community, although they are at the Human Rights Council in Geneva. They've even been allowed a hearing in the US Congress because of the sympathy and support of some US congressmen. It's still peripheral, it's still small. If things go on the way they are, there is no ruling out the possibility that that support may grow. And if it does, the geostrategic importance of Balochistan, its coast being what it is, I do not think Pakistan can be sanguine about going on in this manner. I've been warning about this for a very long time. The military, the security establishment, politicians, anybody who's within earshot. I'm not getting the kind of response that I expect. There's a complacency and an inertia in thought and scapegoating, and therefore hiding your head in the sand. And ostriches don't win. A country that subscribes to democracy, pays lip service to democracy, but is prepared to exclude a considerable part of its territory and one section of its populace, is asking for trouble in the future. Not enough awareness of that, I'm afraid.